tax collections. And how much stress is placed on corruption within national borders, especially public officers' collections, and also negligent expenditure of taxes which have been collected. Because you have instances where the government spends on a contract for, say, road repairs, and they contract with somebody who's not properly qualified to do the road, and within a month or two, they have to do a further contract. All that is negligent expenditure. So what do the nationals do about that? Right, you can talk about it and so on, but how can they focus effective action and highlight the government and try to change the conduct of these government officials? I will end there because I would love to hear our expert, Soledad.
Thank you.
In Spanish? Well, thank you so much. I would like to tell all of you that this hearing is perhaps one of the most interesting ones in this period, and one of the most interesting ones that I've participated in. I would like to ask you all about 5 points here. We have been asking these questions all afternoon, but I will keep my questions to 5 points. I know that in constitutional jurisprudence of many countries there is the principle of tax justice or tax equity. How do you all think that that principle can be connected with the idea of human rights in fiscal policies? First question. Secondly, the second question. What concrete proposals would you all make to governments in our region to reduce the regressive nature of tax policy? A third point that perhaps doesn't appear in your participation, and I'm very interested in this. What strategies do you all believe that would be necessary to implement for tax formalization? Because in some countries there are many industries that are not formalized in a tributary sense. A fourth point, not just speaking about evasion, because evasion is a crime, but it's no secret that one of the services that large companies and small and medium-sized ones contract and which companies offer is the service of planning to minimize taxation. So what policies do you believe should be implemented in relation to this idea of minimizing tax payment, which in a principle falls within the framework, the legal framework, but in the end it leaves us with zero to minimal taxation. And the final point is, this is the matter which I find most concerning in Latin America. How do we break with the following matter of tension? On the one hand, states need to collect from large investors because these are the ones who generate the most revenue and wealth with their activities. But on the other hand, states need to attract investors, and the way to attract investors is giving them tax benefits. So what proposals do you have, or might you have, for governments? This is all connected to human rights, of course, because with these taxes, we pay for social rights. So thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Clark.
Mantia, and good afternoon, everyone. And I have to say, I think with Commissioner Bernal and myself, this is our first physical hearing. So really happy to not be in the Zoom space. And you all are the first hearing where we're not in the Zoom space in our term. I want to start off by, first of all, thanking everyone for your presentations, and I accept with absolutely no reservation that fiscal policy is determinant of the state capacity to progressively realize economic and social rights, and also, of course, civil and political rights. That's let's call it a truism. There's really no other way to get money rather than through a fiscal policy to realize social protection, education, healthcare, all the things that we want. And also to end poverty, and I think someone talked about a fairer country, and I like that very simple description of what we're trying to get to, fairer countries. So I also agree with the formulation that human rights is also key to the process of developing fiscal policies on the revenue generation side, as well, importantly, in how, and Commissioner Macaulay has already spoken to it, how countries spend money, what is the status of expenditure. And so who determines that policy is very much that process, that participation that you spoke about is so much part of will determine the outcome. And we do know in highly unequal countries, elites, political and economic elites, have a disproportionate impact on the formulation of all kinds of state policy, and certainly on fiscal policy. And that's probably why we have regressive tax regimes, because, of course, people who have income want to pay less than what we would consider to be their fair share. So I accept everything you've said, and I don't know enough about Latin American economies, and I think what you've said there seems to me quite logical and relevant. But I'm wondering, because I come from the Caribbean, what are the limits, in any event, to this fiscal policy? Are there limits to fiscal policy to realize socioeconomic rights in small island developing states, and indeed in countries which are disproportionately affected by climate crisis? So I think in the Caribbean, and you all are the tax experts, and maybe you know better than I, but we generally have progressive tax regimes and consumption tax, things like the value-added tax, and also progressive income tax, and then other kinds of tax regimes, generally in the direction of fairness, generally speaking. And a lot of our expenditure is on social services, education, health, and social protection. But we have countries that are highly indebted because the shape of the economies, how the economies are structured, so they're so externally oriented that you're not producing much of anything, and you're consuming everything you consume, you have to bring in. So you have chronic balance of payment problems, and then you have indebtedness. And on top of that, you have the climate crisis impacts, the hurricanes that would completely destroy economies, completely destroy infrastructure, and you start from scratch. So I'm not sure, and also in countries where you have high levels of informality, not so much so in the context of informality of big, medium, or large enterprises, but informality, people selling on the streets and doing their business, and kind of outside of formalization of tax regimes. So there's leakage like that, but I suppose that's why value-added tax was implemented, to try to get around some of that kind of leakage which comes with informality. So all that to say, my question really has to do with the limits of fiscal policy in the context of global macroeconomic structures. And as you would know, many countries in the Caribbean have been really talking about the characterization of Caribbean economies as middle income, which puts them outside of concessionary finance, and also then in the ambit of what we can call venture capital, vulture capitalists, not even venture, vulture capitalists. And so I'm just wondering, what are from your thinking and your research, fair fiscal policy, which is purely connected with internal processes, can take you so far, but maybe they won't take you outside of the challenges that you already pose, indebtedness compounded by climate crisis, and compounded by pandemic and shutdown of economies and so on. So I just want to know what's your thinking about fair fiscal policy, which is also connected to global macroeconomic structures, neoliberalism.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Rapporteur Garcia, I would like to make some comments. Firstly, as my colleagues have said, I think it's very important to have this discussion, this debate. I also believe that it's of fundamental importance to construct principles which guide us toward certain general topics which must be implemented in matters of fiscal policy and human rights. The main challenge comes when these principles are faced with different realities. And For instance, situations like the pandemic, which has been mentioned, and also corruption in countries with a rate not exceptional corruption, but where corruption is the rule. In that sense, I have 2 points that I'd like to ask about. How the matter of tax differences which are assigned in some countries, I'm thinking of the case of Colombia, where certain companies receive tax benefits and they hire women who are the head of the family, who are victims of violence. How do we propose these tax benefits? How do we differentiate them, considering that not all situations are the same, and thinking of countries like Peru and others which have a high rate of informality of the informal economy? It's not very likely to involve tax policy. On that line, I'm thinking of the case of women who traditionally are involved in jobs which are most poorly paid, and most of the informal economy, cleaning, cooking. This is something that falls outside of the formal economy, and here I would also like to see how this fiscal policy, because it goes hand in hand with what we were talking about with pensions. For instance, the committee in the case of Trujillo, Cadero against Ecuador versus Ecuador, in this case where taxation was interrupted and then taxation began again, and there's this gap, this vacuum in the pension. The committee established the necessity of states establishing non-contributive pensions for elderly people, in this case elderly women, and especially within this fiscal policy. How can we think about a policy for non-contributive issues? Now I will cede the floor to the rapporteur. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to begin by expressing my appreciation for this hearing. I'd like to thank the Commission for expressing their commitment in this sense with economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. And of course, I'd like to thank all the organizations and colleagues from civil society who have requested this and prepared this with such seriousness in preparation for this hearing. As all of you have said very well, this is an issue of priority for us, and I would like to also add a bit to what has been summed up for us, with the exception that on this path that we are on, in order to center on our agenda in the Commission the matter of fiscal and economic policies. This year, for instance, our annual report, one of the tendencies and the information that we include and that we have been monitoring for each one of the 35 states in the hemisphere has to do with their fiscal and economic policies. This is a very important piece of the work we need to do, and we need to evaluate the status of human rights in a country. We need to pay attention to our budgets and tax regulations and economic policies, including the resources that are mobilized with financial actors or international financial players. As well, I would like to point out how in the Organization of American States, the matter of social justice and critical poverty and the equitable distribution of wealth has been present since the constitutional Magna Carta in Article 34. Chapter 7 sets out an extraordinary basis to work not only in relation to states which have ratified and signed the San Jose Agreement in Costa Rica, but which are also part of the OAS, including this country which is receiving us here as the Commission. So that's another reflection. Before beginning this period of sessions, the ESCR has been visiting Los Angeles and visiting people, more than 60,000 people living on the streets in the state of California, 40,000 in the city of Los Angeles. This is an indicator of the fact that this is an important topic to handle in all of the societies of the Americas. I would like to ask a few questions. On the one hand, if you have time, I believe that one of the greatest challenges for the inter-American system of human rights is to continue building bridges of connection between the work and dialogue in a constructive sense with economic players internationally and nationally.
That would include also tax authorities,
their IRS equivalents, international institutions? What are the recommendations that you would have for the Commission for this rapporteurship in that sense? Because this seems to be a critical element in these conversations. And also, based on the work that we've been doing with, in terms of the private sector, corporations, human rights, we also understand that the capture of tax policies by corporations, by the private sector, has a very serious role to play on this. And lastly, you have set out some important principles, and from the ESCER, we are working on a resolution that wants to translate these principles into an actual tool for the Human Rights Commission. I would like to ask you, what is the usefulness or the impact that these principles could have on public policies within these states and within the entities of the OAS? Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Rapporteur, and now I give the floor to civil society. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Commission and to the Rapporteur. It's my understanding we have 22 minutes left, so we are going to use 2 to make some specific requests that we didn't set out in our prior intervention. And so I'm going to start with these requests. And by the way, thank you for everything that you've expressed to us so far, your observations. We would like to start out by stating that, taking into account what we have previously stated, we believe that it is urgent and essential that a link be set out between human rights and fiscal policy, especially in terms of the context that has already been set out here, so that we don't lose out on a unique opportunity to resolve these issues that are at the heart of the vulneration, the violations of human rights in our region. So we would like to make these guidelines more visible, so that they can be aligned in terms of human rights and in terms of fiscal policy, so they become a reality, operational as soon as possible. Also, we would like to request from this distinguished commission that firstly they adopt a thematic resolution on fiscal policy and human rights that sets out in a systematic fashion progress that has been made in this area and that fosters the inter-American standards for monitoring fiscal policies, and including the ESCER points that we have stated previously. And we also are available to provide all support needed for the Commission in this area, including our previous work, reports, and studies as to fiscal policy and human rights. We would also like to continue to ask that the analysis be continued in terms of fiscal policies when you are selecting your thematic issues for your period of sessions, that you include this. And when you speak to different states in terms of their obligations for budgeting, for their economic policies as stated in the Protocol of San Salvador. And that in future procedures, when the UN is working on fiscal policy, that a summit be called for Latin America with 2 main purposes, which is to apply these standards to these spaces and also to foster institutionality within these debates, so that the decision making is transparent, it's accountable, and it allows for open participation. In terms of following up with these processes, we would like to work with the entities that are present on a regional level, like ECLAC and other entities that are fully aligned with the standards of this commission. For example, the Buenos Aires agreement in the 15th Conference on Women. Lastly, we would like to underscore the pioneering role that ESCER has had in this area and in human rights in the region, and in the monitoring activity that they have applied for these rights. And again, we are offering you all of our studies, information, and reports for this work that lies ahead. So this is a first response. I will keep my microphone on. We are going to continue with our response, and we are going to try to respond to everything that has been asked about here. one of the points that we have heard is how to analyze fiscal policy to reduce poverty, how they are structured, because it's not just about collecting enough taxes to take care of the ESCER and human rights, but we understand that human rights also protect your basic rights. In Colombia, they are now thinking about what is to be taxed, because what is taxed also affects basic rights of the population. So it's important in terms of looking for justice for fiscal policy within the framework of human rights, and to guarantee that basic needs are protected. It's also linked to citizenship, the principles of human rights. When we think about educating our citizens on fiscal policy, understanding what a budget entails, how a government collects taxes, and also how the spending is assigned, that should be part of the rights of every citizen as well, as it was previously stated. When we speak about corruption, we understand that that is a key issue for the design of this fiscal policy. We know that this has been included in the reports on corruption, connecting corruption to the best use of the resources of a state. State should apply these resources to the guarantee of the ESCER, but also in terms of corruption, we can impose specific fiscal policies. For example, as the Anti-Corruption Inter-American Convention, as it states that there's a sanction for people who have committed crimes of corruption. That should be linked to fiscal policy as well as to transparency. Tax transparency, that is something that we would look for as well, because that's a way to prevent corruption. Some of the questions by Commissioner Bernal Pulido, well, he really is the expert here on this panel, but in terms of specific proposals to reduce regressivity, for example, certain types of taxes could be better applied in the region. There are some initiatives like INCEL works on property taxes, real estate taxes. In the entire region, when you look at the numbers, you analyze the numbers, you can see the important impact that these type of taxes have on windfall profits and on real estate profits. So that is something that should also be studied for the region in terms of formal tax policy. There are strategies being discussed. Strengthening the work that tax authorities do, that tax collectors do. A lot of the time it has to do with taxing correctly and in strengthening tax collection and the work that tax collectors do, and giving them more resources for these tax agencies. As for minimizing tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax policies, well, there's a lot to be said on that, but one of the things that you can do related to human rights is to evaluate your tax system so you can see what are the loopholes, what are the tax benefits, what are the tax strategies, and that's where we see that sometimes those who create these tax policies make it easy to avoid paying as many taxes as they should. Also, Commissioner Clark has spoken on the limits of fiscal policies. I think this illustrates very well how it works within the framework of human rights. This should entail cooperation between the states, international cooperation, a universal language. And we see that there's a lot of cooperation within the Inter-American system, but it's not always the case for domestic fiscal policy. It works more internationally. So the avoidance of harming human rights, well, a lot of the times the states still have to comply with their human rights within their own territories. So I know others will be able to speak a little bit more in depth on this issue. Also, we have public debt, which is part of tax policy. within this perspective. And we have human rights mandates like the Special Rapporteur on Debt and Human Rights. And we know that they have been making progress along these lines. As for Commissioner Mantilla, I can briefly say that the example of Social Security or pension plans, yes, that is very useful to us in order to illustrate the potential of better tax policies. Why? Because non-defined contributions, for pensions, means that oftentimes there's not enough resources. One of the petitioning entities for this hearing did a study that showed that you could really strengthen the pension plan or the Social Security plan in Argentina, which is known for being one of the most expensive in the region. So this does not also reduce their discretional activity, but it does offer more security for the future for the people who would receive these pensions, for women, for example, who do all the caretaking work without pay in society. So with this, I will now give the floor to my colleague. Thank you very much for your questions and your observations. I would also like to briefly try to respond to some of those observations. And, well, Maria Emilia has already mentioned a lot of the items that I was going to touch upon, but I think that strengthening the capacity of public institutions, the tax authorities, that is important in order to resolve a lot of these problems. And as they are strengthened and the tax collection numbers improve in the region, we can better fight tax avoidance and tax evasion. We can also implement policies to deal with informal work and not have to exclude people who are doing informal work. Many times they do that work not because they want to, but because the system does not include them for formal work. We can also reduce the regressive nature of the taxing system if it's done more efficiently, as Maria Emilia has said. And in our Oxfam report, we do have different proposals, for example, to strengthen net income, capital income, windfall benefits. And as Ivan also mentioned, it's 73 people who are billionaires in Latin America. These are very few. Very small group of people. If we were to tax them at 1% on their wealth or maybe at 2%, well, we can figure out the percentage later on. That would be a more technical conversation, but we know that we would get enough resources to offer more resources, public resources, 36% more for our public health systems, for example. And on corruption, it would also strengthen the work of governments, of states. You cannot not link them between themselves, because the more taxes you're able to collect, the better you're able to fight corruption. So I'm sure everybody else can respond to the other questions that were made. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to highlight another one of the elements of human rights in terms of fiscal policy. I would like to say that this is applicable to the entire cycle, from its designation, citizens or the people's participation, transparency, evaluation. I mean, you're going to see that it entails the entire conversation on human rights, how a fiscal policy with a human rights view could be implemented. I think one of the main problems that all of these questions have in common is the lack of regulation in terms of fiscal policy. There are so many tax benefits that are offered in the region, and that is due to a large extent in the fact that these are created from one day to the next without justifying or being accountable to anyone, without studying the population, where they live, their income, their race, their gender. I think it's way overdue in the region to be able to offer more transparent information as to the work that the tax system does and the tax authorities do. We can see that Latin America can be very well evaluated oftentimes in terms of their budgeting, but in terms of their tax collection and the use of public funds, there is a lot of work to do still. And I think that that should also be resolved in terms of fiscal policy. Thank you very much. Well, I feel that these questions have been very interesting. I would like to speak mainly on 3 of the areas that these questions have in common. One of them is the importance of really dealing with fiscal policy, not just in terms of how many taxes you collect, but in terms of the budgets, a fair assignment of the budget of funding, and in terms of how this is applied. In several countries, they have really made a lot of progress by getting the participation, a participatory budget from their communities. This is an example how from a local level you can start to broaden the presence of citizenship of the people and how they can also see where resources are applied. There is a lot to do, however, still a lot of work still to do in terms of transparency and participation for civil society, so that everyone may participate in the design of fiscal policy in general. There was also a question on how countries can collect more taxes. I think we've heard from my colleagues here already on that. We should also think about how within the committees of the UN, how they have advised different countries during their periodical reports. They have given them advice on how to monitor any illegal financial flows. They have advised them, they've given them guidance on that in the countries who receive as well these illegal financial flows. For example, somewhere like Switzerland. Well, the committee has consulted with Switzerland to say, how do you check for illegal financial flows? Where we see that countries need these resources, and a lot of these resources are being sent to tax havens, tax paradises. So this is something that should also be applied on a regional level. Also, Commissioner Mantilla has asked on how important is it for working women, for their day-to-day lives, and the women who do unpaid work, how important is it for them in terms of the issue of social protection, tax collection? After the pandemic, we have seen that unpaid work done by women has increased tremendously, along with issues like domestic violence.
While women were leaving the informal market, the amount of unpaid work increased. I think it's very important to take into consideration how fiscal austerity policies, what they really do is displace the burden of care from men to women and in general from the shoulders of the shoulders of the family and the home. It's a very important topic to set forth how austerity policies in the post-pandemic context are being implemented once again, and I believe that there's an important role of human rights entities to prevent this from continuing to be implemented, because what it does is deepen the situation of the dispossession and lack of protection for women in a more concrete sense. I believe that gender biases are very important to be eliminated. There are direct and indirect forms of bias in taxation that women pay for instance, in indirect taxing. Although there has been progress and recognition, as has been mentioned in the case of certain countries where some of the indirect taxes like VAT for products that fall upon the responsibility of women, there are also gender biases in the sense of direct taxation. For instance, in Argentina, income derived comes through the declaration of a husband's tax declaration. So there are these implicit and explicit forms of biases that we are facing, and this would contribute, combating this would contribute to improving the situation of human rights for women. I will now give the floor. Thank you very much for the questions. I will be very brief because my colleagues have answered almost everything. I would simply like to thank the Commissioner Carlos Bernal for one of the questions, because I believe that regarding this relationship with constitutional law in our region, and I believe that there is a dialogue that's very important that we have tried to have in drawing up and proposing these principles. So we are taking into consideration the vocabulary of a focus of human rights, but also the vocabulary of constitutional law in our region, which has principles not only regarding taxation, but also regarding public spending. That's a very important point to look at. And it's something more precise than simply equity or justice. For instance, there are principles of tax equality and public expenditure, which we incorporate as equality, substantive equality. There's a long path to go down, and I believe it's very important for the Commission for this tradition to exist, because it means that everything that we are saying is rooted in our own traditions, in our legal traditions or cultural legal traditions. And then with what was said by the rapporteur, the concern regarding perhaps the focus that multilateral organs that make a part of the United Nations, but as we know, they are not receptive very much to the language of human rights. And we know that the IMF and the World Bank are very important players in our region. So I believe that all of the work of seeing to it that these institutions incorporate in their analyses a human rights perspective is a very positive point. For instance, issues of public debt that our region faces, the IMF has manuals and rules to evaluate this sustainability in economic terms, but we talk about sustainability in terms of environmental terms, in human rights terms. That's why the important dialogue with economists is important. We can operationalize this and express this in a very precise way to be able to have a conversation not in an abstract sense, but in a precise sense with economists and other actors regarding these public policies. We'll be concluding, but I'll give you 2 minutes if you'd like to say anything. Thank you very much. I'll be short. First off, regarding the question about the recommendations for states within the region, I'd like to emphasize regional cooperation, and I believe that currently states cannot face the crises in an isolated form. I believe that regional cooperation is necessary. That's what will make it possible for countries in the region to develop these tax policies, and what we need to do is create this bloc, a Latin American bloc, to move these tax policies forward, align with human rights, in the context of the communications made by Colombia. It's not easy to reach an agreement to discuss with governments about how to move forward, but there are 2 key elements that we need to have. Progressivity. We need progressivity, which makes it possible to face inequality, poverty, climate issues, and a strict commitment with expanding the capacity for revenue and income, as my colleague mentioned, especially regarding matters of energy. This issue of having contributions in a tax sense, this is very important for Latin America. And a second idea that should be rescued here is related to moving toward dealing with tax evasion in a more concrete sense, having a joint definition. What is involved in a tax haven in the Americas, to see who are the parties that are benefited from such a situation, and the location and existence of tax havens. Thank you very much to all of you. This is the conclusion of this hearing. I would like to repeat our thanks to the Inter-American Commission for this work. This hearing is also being broadcast online. I think that it will reach many people interested in these matters, both at a state and a civil society level in this interdisciplinary work. These are not only matters that economists are dealing with, these are issues that many of us are involved in within the region. I would like to thank my colleagues, and we will now conclude this hearing.
Record.